Okay, great. All right, hopefully you guys are all very caffeinated for what's going to be a very exciting discussion, tying together, I hope, a lot of the themes that we've been speaking about this morning. My name is Nabiha Syed. I am Vice President of Legal at Buzzfeed. Ben did not break any rules in the earlier panel, so I'm happy to report. And we are joined with just by some amazing, amazing rock stars. You have their bios already in front of you, but briefly, we have Emily Bell, who is famous as the director of the Tao Center for Digital Journalism and so many other things. We have Casey Newton, Silicon Valley editor at The Verge, and Surya Mattu, a reporter for the Markup, which is a very exciting new digital data journalism initiative, which maybe we'll get to in this, maybe not, we'll see. All right, so I'm told that we have 30 minutes of the geniuses chatting and then 30 minutes including questions from you guys, so we'll hop to it. Emily, in June, you published a guide named Friend and Foe that was about the relationship between tech platforms and reporters and news publishers. And there's a lot to unpack in that title, Friend and Foe, but why don't you take a stab at it?
Well, it's the latest in a number of reports we're doing on looking at the relationship between tech platforms and newsrooms in particular. And we're basically just running out of titles at this point because we did the one before that was called The Platform Press: How Silicon Valley Re-Engineered Journalism, and that sort of gives you a clue, I think, as to sort of how we've tried to chart the trajectory. About not just kind of, I think that a lot of people who are outside the industry, the journalism industry, see the relationship largely through the prism of being one of distribution. And actually, if you're inside the industry, it looks very, very different because it is every single part of journalism, apart from reporting, which I think is something we'll talk about, has effectively been subsumed by or taken over by the platforms. So monetization, circulation, I would argue as well, sort of to some extent, sort of commissioning. So the work that we do at the Tao Center and the report we brought out in June was really, if you like, a kind of a pulse check on where we are with that relationship. And what was really interesting is that I think that we've seen this kind of maturing of what I'd hesitate to call a sort of, a very fractious partnership, where it's very clear, I think, that the dependency that publishers have on platforms is one which is not necessarily helping them, but it's also not one that they can necessarily break away from. And one of the most interesting facets of this is how much of, if you like, tension there is between reporting on what are these vast systems of power and actually kind of working with them to, quote somebody, well, not to actually quote, but just to, an anecdote from somebody who comes from a large publisher said to me, the irony is that we have a team of reporters who are sort of tearing down Facebook on a daily basis. And then in another room, we actually have engineers who are figuring out what products to build with Facebook engineers. So, kind of our sort of conclusions from this really were that that there is this unhealthy dependency on platform technology, but there's also kind of it's not clear that this is benefiting journalism as much as it ought to be. But there isn't, no good news here. There isn't necessarily a sort of a path out of it. Some of what I think we've been talking about earlier today, things like sort of direct relationships with the readers are now being sort of held up as this is the way to go. But the truth of the matter is that the way that people behave online and how they get their news doesn't actually sort of, that works for a very, very, very small number of businesses, but it doesn't work for lots of other businesses, including much smaller publishers, including local publishers. And that's actually worth saying as well. The last thing I'll say is that what we noticed was, just as Josh and Ben and Jack were saying in the previous panel, scale and your connections in this world really, really matter. So local publishers are completely left out of this conversation. They find it incredibly hard. It is making what's already a sort of very hard existence for them much harder. So not only have they lost all their advertising revenue, but they don't really have the tools all the time or the resources to take any kind of like benefit from this new system of lower cost distribution, etc.
Well, with that optimistic take on the infrastructure around the relationship, the friend and foe relationship, I do, as you flagged, want to drill into sort of how this affects the actual reporting and how reporting lives and dies in this infrastructure. And so as a First Amendment lawyer, right, when you think about the First Amendment, you think about how the founders conceived of really two poles, right? There were the people who were the press, who would be writing, often speaking critically of the government, and then the government as the locus of power that would have incentives to be like, hey, shut up. Like, don't speak truth to this power. We don't need you to do that. And then you have the sort of First Amendment that's meant to prevent that kind of intrusion. And then, of course, you have, basically about 100 years of modern jurisprudence interpreting all of that relationship between the press and the government. But now we have, as Jack Balkin and many others have theorized, we have this third pole of power, right? We have the platforms who are here who could also exercise the ability to silence reporting. Casey, you've been covering Silicon Valley for years. You have an amazing newsletter about content moderation, just a plug for Casey. And you've written about the Supreme Court for content moderation. How are you thinking about this power dynamic, and what have you seen?
Sure. So the idea for a Supreme Court of content moderation comes from Markup himself in the aftermath of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Some of you may remember he went on Ezra Klein's podcast and said that eventually he kind of wanted to defer some of Facebook's power to some sort of theoretical body. And he didn't give any details about how this would work. But I wrote earlier this year that I do think that it is inevitable. We know that Facebook and these platforms generally are loath to make really tough editorial calls. They're doing it, but they're doing it begrudgingly. And there's no grievance process for people who feel like Facebook got it wrong. Now, you heard earlier today someone from Facebook said, we're going to give more ways for you to appeal, and we're going to report back on more ways that you can appeal. But they have only just begun to explore this. And if you take as a given that these platforms are enormously consequential, that a great deal of the most important political speech of our time is unfolding on these platforms, if you believe that some of the reporting that reporters are doing about these platforms is going to need API access or is going to require some sort of intersection between these bodies that Facebook itself might not like, ultimately, I think it's going to be in their interest to devolve some of that power down to a body where they can throw up their hands and say, look, we have this body and it has clear rules for how you can get on it, and their word is final. It's sort of remarkable that at this late date in history, so much of these decisions comes down to like, well, how does Jack Dorsey feel about it? How does Mark feel about it today? And not only is it sort of how are they feeling today, but they don't have to tell us how they feel, right? Like in the American judicial system, courts have to publish their rulings. They have to publish their opinions. There's case law that develops over time that, lets us chart the evolution of the way we think about these things. And we don't have any of it now. So I think that we need to get there, and a Supreme Court might be one way we see that start to happen.
So we don't have one of those yet. Yeah. Platforms have not availed themselves of that kind of structure. And so in the current landscape, and feel free to talk about any of the platforms, all three of you, are we seeing moderation of what news organizations, what reporters are putting out? And what are some concrete examples we can sort of unpack here?
I think Surya has a really good one.
Sure. Sorry. Hi. So the example that I like to talk about in terms of Facebook and content moderation is an investigation I did when I worked with Kashmir Hill at Gizmodo. And Kashmir had been interested in Facebook's people you may know algorithm and understanding how that impacts people's lives and how it can harm people. So it started off a long time ago as a story around a psychiatrist who would tell her that they would get recommended their patients on Facebook and they had no idea why. And from there, I built us a tool and we did some investigations and collected a bunch of data. And basically, through the 6 to 8 months we did this, we found concrete examples of people like sex workers and members of the LGBTQ community being harmed by this algorithm because they basically had no way to opt out of it and no way to really be able to, they had no agency over how this was working. And when we spoke to Facebook about this, they said that, oh yeah, you can totally like turn this off, just go to your settings, privacy, drop down, say no one can see me, and that's fine. Turns out the only people who have that drop down option are people who they consider to be public figures. So there's actually no way for anyone to opt out of this, right? And when you start getting into the conversations that that Facebook and Twitter are having right now, this data that we collected, this wouldn't even be covered under GDPR or any kind of, because it's not considered your data, right? Like your people you may know suggestions aren't, there's no API access, there's no way to do any of this. And we built a tool that let our readers do this themselves, and then Facebook sent us a cease and desist, saying that, but they didn't send us a cease and desist. They said they would send it. It was basically, they said our tool was in violation to the terms of service, and because of that, we should take it down. And we did eventually change it. It kind of like fell off because it was right before the Cambridge Analytica stuff broke. But yeah, so just as an example of one of these moderations, I think that's one.
I think that's something that, we all talk about among ourselves a great deal. I run a sort of a centre which researches journalism. It's almost impossible to do that these days unless you've got some sort of API access to the platforms, because so much of what we do and how stories travel and what we understand about them resides within those platforms. And API access has been choked steadily for the last sort of 3 years. It's almost like kind of anything that you used to be able to get as useful research material has either disappeared or really been very, very sort of tightly restricted. And there is this kind of argument that we can't, it's really important we don't open up data because otherwise something like Cambridge Analytica might happen. It's like, well, hang on a second, Cambridge Analytica has actually happened. And the only reason we know about it is because of independent researchers and journalists. So there's more ways to kind of moderate journalism in a way than just saying we're going to take this down. Or we're not going to take it down. It's also kind of how do you throw kind of sand in the cogs of the machine that actually sort of looks into this. And this is where it's so it's kind of almost like a bizarre situation where you have these large organisations that are not intrinsically journalistic, who are effectively the free press of the 21st century, and they haven't wanted that responsibility, and they haven't planned for it, and they're not really designed for it. I'm not sort of letting them off the hook. My other sort of favourite how does AP moderate journalists was when Facebook, how does Facebook moderate journalists? When AP broke the story about, or had a very early cut of the story about the data breach on Facebook, I tried to post that link on Facebook saying, everybody, you should just check if you're on here, just check that your data has not been leaked. And you couldn't post it, and sort of nobody could post the AP link, and Facebook was saying this may be spam. Everybody is trying to post it, and obviously, kind of like they had a kind of override on it. But then you think, this is America. We all know, that kind of that everybody's sort of looking at this conversation on Twitter. But it's just an example of how kind of stories can just be sort of disappeared or downranked. I mean, Facebook says it would much rather downrank things than it would wipe them off the platform. How do we know what's been downranked?
Right, we have this sort of, there's the hard censorship of, okay, no one can see this, which is sort of a brute force, blunt approach to it. And then you see these more subtle, softer forms of censorship. Do you feel like you have an open line of communication to the platforms on this? And I'd be curious in hearing about not only Facebook, but also Twitter, YouTube, where there's so much information, misinformation also consumed by so many. I'd love to hear about your experiences with these different platforms too.
One of the reasons I like writing about this stuff is that I do find that platforms are very sensitive to criticism. This would not be true if I was writing about Amazon or Apple, neither of which would care about almost anything that I wrote, right? But Facebook, Google and YouTube, Twitter, they really do care. They don't always act quickly or effectively, but they very much are listening. And one criticism I do think that they've taken to heart is the idea that journalists are responsible for more and more, it seems, of the content moderation on their platform, right? It's constantly journalists who are bringing to their attention some of the worst excesses and abuses. But the platforms have responded. And one way that I think you can see this is there was this genre of journalism that developed where in the immediate aftermath of any national or global calamity, journalists would just go and search the name of the calamity on YouTube, and then instantly there would be 47 videos explaining that it was a hoax, it was a false flag operation, right? It was all George Soros and the liberals. And so, journalists wrote lots of great stories about how anybody who was trying to learn anything about this on YouTube was just getting a bunch of nonsense. And, many of us, myself included, went to YouTube and said, have you considered just putting people maybe with journalism backgrounds or just having literally anyone search these keywords in the immediate aftermath of a calamity? And yesterday, in the wake of the mail bombings that are happening, journalists went and they started searching those on YouTube, and guess what? News came up, like actual reporting came up. And it's because they've been sensitive to those criticisms. So, their relationship is sometimes tense and there's a lot of angry back and forth. And I think sometimes they get really mad, but overall, I do have to say they're paying attention.
My only kind of take on this is that one, none of these problems are actually like new for these companies. If you look through like the FTC complaints brought against the company or people who have complained to the FTC about harms that these platforms have caused them, all of this stuff is kind of in there from like 2008, right? So there's some form or the other of like someone being harmed and some grievance being brought up. So for example, the people you may know stuff, it's in there. Someone has brought this up as a complaint against a sexual harasser. So for me, like, what's kind of frustrating as a journalist in this space is like you're basically in a privately owned public space, and the way you're kind of having to navigate that space is one in fear of a CFAA violation, right? And on top of that, they're also gaslighting you, right? So like when we talk about like Cambridge Analytica and cool, Jack and Mark Zuckerberg went and spoke to the Senate, but we still don't have numbers. They just tell us the numbers change. They don't tell us how they're measuring it. The same with the video metrics stuff that came out this week. So I think the problem is we don't know what the ground is on which we're standing. So everything on top of that just becomes like...
No, I think actually sort of however frustrating it is here, I do think the thing which is reshaping how the platforms behave most quickly is, if you like, sort of what's happening elsewhere. So people here, I'm sure, are familiar with the story of the Rohingya in Myanmar, but I think that was a kind of that in a way was a sort of a perhaps as much of, if not more of a tipping point internally in Facebook, I got the impression, than, say, Cambridge Analytica, because suddenly you're on the hook for what, kind of pretty much looked like war crimes at one level, that actually, and I think that what's really fascinating from somebody, I sort of covered the mass media from a business point of view for a very long time. And, we had a decade where media companies were told, be much more like tech companies. Why can't you be more like tech companies? And now we're actually kind of undergoing a really uncomfortable period of reverse engineering, where we're saying to these big companies, you have to now start to higher humanities graduates, be more like these kind of civically minded organisations. And it's a stretch for them, because it is not what their culture is. And I think that, that they will change, because I think what's happening in the rest of the world is so sort of profound, where these platforms play an outsized role, because there isn't the same history or legacy media organisations. There's no counterweight to the environment that they create. And that, I think, is where they've suddenly hit this wall of, we actually have to make really radical changes internally, otherwise we will not be able to operate.
I want to connect that to something that Surya was saying about the CFAA, so I'm going to call on you for that. But it seems like we have this landscape in which, in the absence, perhaps as this is formalizing internally, to your point, Emily, we have the outside press acting as a check, identifying themes and trends, elevating it, having it be heard, which is a good thing, and then sort of waiting until the next wave comes, and it's sort of this episodic cycle. But Surya, there are real reasons that that researchers can't actually dig into this in a more systematic way, right? Rather than just waiting for what trends, and that is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act issue that you flagged. And I know that the Knight Institute at Columbia has written a letter and sort of outstretched its hand to Facebook and other platforms to say, hey, can you create sort of an exemption for us in recognition of this fact-finding role that we have that's, outsourced help for you. But Surya, can you just tell us what are your concerns? What does that look like on the day-to-day for you as a researcher?
I mean, the main concern is that you don't know who you're going to piss off, right?
Yeah.
When that can, they have a mechanism that they can. It doesn't have to even get that far, but just knowing that they have, with the resources and ability to prosecute you, they can take it to court. And even if it gets thrown out or whatever happens to it, you still have to show up. So it just slows you down and just adds this kind of invisible layer. I mean, I'm just new to this. I'm sure you folks have been thinking about this for a much longer time. But in my experience, you always have to think about what you're doing and who you're upsetting, because if you upset the wrong people, that's more of the concern than the actual journalist kind of content of the story you're working on.
Right, and the stakes of a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act claim are not only potential civil liability if you hit a certain measure, but also criminal, right? And that all of a sudden starts to look very different than the normal concerns that reporters have of oh no, yet another libel lawsuit or a privacy lawsuit. This is a different stakes, sort of tethered in this realm. But I'd love to hear from Casey and Emily on this too.
Yeah, this year has been such a wild one for that question, because Facebook really is, in particular, is getting the pressure from both sides. The Cambridge Analytica story I've written many times is one of the weirdest scandals that has ever happened in the technology industry, because it largely concerned information that we had already known for 2 years. And it really just kind of, it came back into the light in a really strange way, but really captured people's attention. And it took Facebook 5 days to understand that they were going to have to apologize for something where they didn't even think they had done anything wrong. So, it was super weird. But of course, one of the things that coming out of that is this enormous pressure to lock down as much of the data as you possibly can, right? Because if you're Facebook, the number one thing you want to do is prevent the next Cambridge Analytica, which is hard to prevent because you still can't even really understand how this happened in the first place, that this became such a big issue for you, right? So you have that. And then on the other side, you have all the researchers saying, look at what you're doing in Myanmar and the Philippines and Sri Lanka. We need API access to understand this. And, and the United Nations is going to issue a report saying that you're complicit in genocide. And so Facebook has really had a pretty tough needle to thread there, right? And I do think I don't know why I'm in the role of Facebook apologist on this panel, but what the hell? It's fun
Someone should be.
I like being controversial. But to their credit, this summer they did start to put out some mechanisms by which researchers could apply for more API access. And I haven't seen the APIs. Emily, tell me if they're terrible. I would also note that Twitter did a similar thing. They issued an RFP. They're working with academics, and they have also sort of tried to make more of this API access. So again, they have a tough balancing act to strike there.
Has YouTube?
No, YouTube has done
really
nothing.
YouTube is still a black box of filth.
Yeah.
It's how we call it in our very unbiased research environment. So yes, you're right, Casey. The Facebook have something which is a sort of an organised research call for credentialed academic organisations to research threats to democracy, which is basically, I think, the midterms and elections. But the problem with this is that you have to kind of make an application, then it has to be approved by, albeit an independent panel. And if you get approved, then you're allowed to go ahead and do the research. Now, anyone who's done any research or even any reporting will tell you that that is not how you necessarily find the thing. That's not how you find stuff. How you find stuff is actually just by sort of collecting shit ton of data. Pardon my bad language, because I'm British, can't resist swearing. And if you collect it, you may then be able to find sort of patterns post hoc or whatever. It's rare that you'll know exactly what it is that you're testing. So it's a step in the right direction. I think Jack's kind of call for RFPs also is a step in the right direction. But the thing that I get slightly sick of sitting in rooms with policy people who are actually all very I think sort of they're really good people in the platform companies, is where people say we have to really think about mitigating the risk, and we have to really think about and I'm like, how bad would you like it to get before, what risk could actually make this worse? It's a little bit like Google sort of saying, we don't want to be like Germany, this was the one I got at one conference. Like, we don't want to be like Germany. I was like, why don't you want to be like Germany? I know they have speech laws, but they also have a functioning democracy, 70 years after a genocidal maniac was in charge. And it feels as though, there are these sort of internal sort of absolute kind of, sort of ideals that have been held on to too long. And one of them is, we have to mitigate risk. We can't allow access or research access on the platform. It's actually perfectly easy to do. And give us people. I mean, this is the other thing. This is sort of an access point for journalists, which is I do think they're sort of getting slightly better at this. But it's not just the data. Once you have the data, you need to be able to ask people questions. And it's very frustrating, I think, particularly for a smaller organisation trying to get to, again, as Josh was saying, if you're not connected in Silicon Valley, you won't get through the door. Sorry, that's my rant.
Just to add to that, I think the other, just from a storytelling narrative perspective, one of the challenges with the harms of the big tech platforms is that the harms are distributed, right? So they don't fit into the civil liberties model of me as an individual, right? The way I like to talk about privacy now is not as to mitigate the I have nothing to hide argument, is that to think about it more like a form of digital colonialism, right? Where the data they're extracting from you might have no value to you, but when they collect everyone's data, then they have a thing that can actually change how society works. And the biggest problem we have right now is that we don't have a way to actually articulate what those harms are because we don't know, and we don't have any mechanisms to do that.
I think that's absolutely right. When you see the patterns of behaviour of organisations like United Fruit in South America in the 1950s, you can see some of those being sort of repeated now. But you're right that we don't have that sort of framework. But I do think, and this is where I'm, just as Casey doesn't want to be the apologist for Facebook, I don't want to be the critic of journalists. But I also think that there are some really good, particularly at your shop at Buzzfeed, reporters doing amazing work on the internal workings. Casey did a fantastic piece, which I just give to all my students, about how moderation works, etc., within, or how Facebook is sort of internally structured. There's some brilliant reporting out there. But there's also this kind of shock horror, that I think sort of how we report it as well has to get a little bit less reactive and sort of shock horror, here's another one, social media to blame, etc. We have to sort of, as journalists, sort of move beyond that and accept that there are, more nuanced stories in this as well.
A point I want to raise, and something I think about a lot, is that there are certain ways in which I actually find Facebook in particular incomprehensible, in the sense that it is so large, right? And so it's impossible to keep every relevant fact about Facebook in your head at any given time if you're a journalist or a researcher trying to understand it, or even just someone using it. And that does seem to be relatively unique in the history of the world, right? And it has huge consequences. One of them is if you work at Facebook, you have the same problem, right? Where you don't understand the whole company that you work for, because it is having these strange and unpredictable effects everywhere in the world. You mentioned this really funny example of everyone tries to share the data breach story at the same time, and they can't. And here you have this great example of the free speech people who work at Facebook and believe in it are undermined by the spam people who work at Facebook who also believe in that problem, right? And who it also support. And so everywhere you look, as you write about this organization, you just sort of find one team undermining the other, right? Where you have the folks who build encryption at WhatsApp so they can protect activists. They're finding that in Brazil and India, it's being used thanks to its viral sharing mechanics to whip up mobs and to spread misinformation, and are sort of
Jared Kushner has been talking to Mohammed bin Salman on it.
I read that story as well.
Just putting it out there.
Yeah. And by the way, this is a point that has no real takeaway other than please sign up for my newsletter where I try to understand this a little better every day. But man, when you have something like that is so big, that is so utterly incomprehensible, I don't know. My hands feel really, really tied. But it's also why like all of my opinions about Facebook tend to be very weakly held because it can all change.
Yeah,
in minutes.
Yeah, you look like you're trying to jump in here.
Just one thing, which is that like in 2010 or like what 2009, the Arab or 2000, when I forget the year now, but when Arab Spring happened and they all owned that, like I just find that my biggest kind of critique of all of this is that we don't have an empirical measure of what's actually the reality on the ground, right? So so everything we're saying like Facebook's bad, Google's bad, we don't know. We actually just don't know what the deal is.
I think we can make some. I'm not sure that we can say they're definitely not. But things change. I mean, I do think they're genuinely trying. But I also think that kind of it was interesting to me today that the Washington Post posted about 13 new jobs, nearly all of which are looking at technology one way or another.
Right.
And we're really under-equipped as I don't wish to. Sort of bring the tone down, but I was talking to a colleague who's an investigative journalist yesterday, and I was saying I increasingly feel like one of the people wearing the tin hats. Like it feels like we could be.
It suits you though.
Yeah, it's just kind of every time we think that this is a real edge case, we then actually discover that it's not an edge case, that it's actually happening. And is it too alarmist to think that what feels like a state of kind of information warfare is actually, sort of that's the immediate and sort of mid-distance future for us? And actually, kind of quite sensible people do think that that's the case now. I don't think it's overstating it to say that we're living in a radically changed political environment, of which communication is a really important and critical part. And as and it's happening just as journalism is actually really kind of weak in terms of foundational sort of financial support. So it's kind of puts journalists and reporters, I think, in this super interesting and really challenging position. And you have great organisations, new organisations like the Verge and like the Markup coming along to sort of tackle these things. But this is going to be I think this is going to be a long old haul.
Well, on the theme of the long fight, I think it's time now for questions. I know that they're apparently coming from the internet land.
Yeah, straight from the internet.
Okay, good. That's where all the good things come from. All right. Do you see a trend in journalism covering Facebook, YouTube, Google, Twitter that seems to have sympathy or greater understanding of the hard problems that platforms face to do content moderation? Casey, as the Facebook apologist on this panel, you want to take that one?
Yes, I recognize that, but I don't have sympathy, and here's why. Everyone who works at Facebook has been trying their very hardest for more than 10 years to bring all of these problems onto themselves, right? They wake up every single day and they say, how can we connect more and more people? Listen to every speech Mark Zuckerberg has ever given. It's all about connecting the entire world. What that means is that every citizen of Earth has a Facebook account. And I think it is understating the case to say that Facebook entered into this project for absolutely no plan for what would happen if it succeeded. They knew that it would be lucrative. I don't think they really projected what the consequences would be of all of that. I don't think we know today what all the consequences will be of that.
It's a result of a move fast, break things mentality, right? And to move fast and break things with the public sphere is a bold move. That's a bold thing to do.
Yeah.
It's also a category error. I remember seeing somebody from Facebook who may have been at this conference earlier, about 3 years ago, who said to me, why are you obsessed with suggesting that we are publishers when we're clearly not, when we're clearly technology companies? And I said, well, somebody who covers this stuff and somebody who researches it, the category error that you're putting yourselves in of being, this is nothing to do with us. Anyone who has even run a community talk board knows that you're eventually going to be dragged into the other category for two reasons, one of which is that there just won't be anybody else left to blame. There's no you just sort of turn around and who's to blame for this? And the other one is that you don't really get to define who you are. Kind of your if you are social, your community defines who you are to a certain extent. And I think that the lack of kind of, or if you like, the good legal reasons for saying, well, we don't want to be dragged into the publisher category, stop them from actually making exactly these sort of calls that Casey is talking about, that they haven't. So no sympathy.
Bold. All right. So we've spoken a lot about Facebook. Can we start to parse out different approaches? And we touched on this a little bit in the platform, but different approaches between the platforms and sort of ways that some people are doing good, ways that people are not good, to use some language from earlier. What are the differences here?
I'll point out something that I like, even though I'm not sure ultimately how effective it's going to be. But one of my favorite concepts to think about is what René DeResta and others call asymmetries of passion. Right, sort of this idea that if you search YouTube for vaccines, all you find is a bunch of videos about how vaccines kill you. Sane people don't make videos about how vaccines prevented them from, getting a terrible disease. And so YouTube has sort of belatedly started to consider this. And as you may have seen, if you now search for is the Earth flat or did the moon landing ever happen, you'll see a little context box underneath the video, which is a hoax, pointing you to a more legitimate news source. It's often Wikipedia, which sort of has problems of its own. But there's at least this idea that if we can surround the bad information with the good, then maybe we can reduce the spread of some of this misinformation. I think that is a step in the right direction. And in fact, Facebook, I think, saw that and is now beginning to consider some of that. Twitter is not doing anything like that, and I think they might want to.
So, I still don't really quite understand why there isn't a YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest, LinkedIn, for public sort of LinkedIn. I've already got into trouble with LinkedIn in the last 24 hours, so I'm not going there again. Wait,
how did you get in trouble with LinkedIn?
Thank you.
You'll have to look on Twitter.
Okay, I'll be right back.
But I don't quite understand why there isn't a sort of a forward-facing body of all of these organisations to talk about these issues kind of openly, where journalists, research organisations, regulators can have some kind of access, because I do think it's a new category of problem for them, the censorship or editing or whatever you want to call it. And actually there's a massive commonality of interest in this area in a way that there probably isn't in any other area. So they are notoriously competitive and they don't want to share sort of trade secrets. But on things like, speech and moderation and what do you do to support the free press, if very disappointing to hear Ben Smith say don't think anybody in Silicon Valley really cares about independent journalism, because if that's the case we really are screwed. But if they are going to sort of care about that and support about it, I do think that there needs to be like some kind of collaboration that just doesn't seem to exist at the moment. I know that it exists in sort of private rooms, but
Well, sure. But also, all of these companies are sort of in a fight to the death, right? All of them encroach gradually onto each other's terrain and, pose varying degrees of existential threats to one another. Now, I do think that in this kind of there was some sort of stability that's reached where Facebook and YouTube and Twitter in particular sort of all have lanes that they're in, and it feels like a relatively stable balance of power. So I think there's actually more opportunity now than there maybe was 5 years ago for them to do more of that stuff. Also, they do collaborate around certain things, like removing terrorist content from the platform, sort of child exploitation. They do some work. So there's a framework, I think, where they can start having more of these conversations.
So someone in the audience is interested in hearing the panelists' thoughts on the idea, as expressed by Josh Marshall in the keynote, that platforms are not quasi-governmental entities and they have the freedom to ban whoever they like. And as, speaking from sort of the media law perspective, right, this is an argument that editorial organizations have made for quite a long time. You do not have the right to be in my paper, on my radio station, whatever. And there's been this aggressive argument for editorial independence. Should there be a more forceful articulation for platform independence?
I don't know, but I will say one thing that's related. I think that's kind of a more abstract point on this issue, which is, I feel like, at least for me, from my vantage point, one of the big challenges is that there's a lack of explicit stating of the values these companies have. And I think if you don't explicitly state the values that you are moderating and running your organization by, the culture around you, that'll just be imbued into the technology you build, right? So I think we're stuck in this kind of conversation between like kind of the seesaw between intentionality and accountability. And the reason we're stuck in that is because at no point has anyone said what they actually believe or what they stand for. And that's so for me, the question you're asking can't really be answered, because at any given point it'll always be like, oh well, we don't stand for that. We're in the middle, and does that make sense?
It does, but can I, before Casey jumps in, I just want to press on it a little bit.
Yeah.
So taking down terrorist content, however defined, or taking down, content that harms children, those seem like proto-articulations of at least standing against something. You want them to push beyond that.
But how do you define a terrorist?
Excellent question, a forever question.
Right. So
Yeah.
so for me, like, it's like
Yeah.
at least state where you're coming from before trying to act like you can regulate this in a neutral way, because there isn't a
Right.
neutral space to stand from.
Right.
I would like to read one of my favorite quotes, if you'll indulge me.
Is it from your newsletter? A third plug now for it?
That is what kills me is that is so fair, but no, it's not. Here's a quote. Remember, you are a guest here. It is not censorship. If you violate the rules and your post is deleted, all civilizations have rules, and if you violate them, you can expect to be ostracized from the tribe. That is from the terms of service on the InfoWars website. And as I wrote about Alex Jones during the month of Alex Jones, I would frequently hear from his fans about, the slippery slope to hell that I was putting us on by suggesting that the platforms enforce their own rules. And it was just very useful to send them the terms of service on InfoWars website and say, I simply think that, we should hold Alex Jones to the same standard that he holds the visitors to his own website to, right? So yes, absolutely. Private companies can make rules for how people behave. You're not allowed to, spray graffiti around a mall, and you shouldn't be allowed to post hate speech on Facebook.
Yeah, I think that they are private companies. They are not in the same position as government. Therefore, the First Amendment doesn't. People make this mistake, I think, often about saying, "Oh, it's an infringement." First, it's non-infringement. It is absolutely not an infringement. But there is, I think it sort of coincides quite neatly with some of the arguments around antitrust law as well. So what we have now are these large companies which are basically norm-setting organisations as well. So it's like the sort of the mass media was in the kind of, the 70s and the 80s, which is just by kind of, shifting the Overton window. I don't even know the Overton window's been shifted. It feels like somebody's punched a hole in the roof. I'll say that. But, by setting what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and it is this articulation of standards. And so this is where I do think they have to become more like editorial type or cultural organisations, which is have the values, re-articulate them, enforce them. And if you ask anybody privately in Facebook or Twitter or YouTube what they should have done with Alex Jones, what they actually all say is we should have just got rid of him sooner. Because and it's like, it's not hard to make that decision. It's just that when you get tied up in this, but we're supporting free speech, that, kind of actually you need to have a much more developed idea of what free speech is.
Right. Like, there was a cementing of that norm that Kate, of course, has brilliantly written about in The New Governors, and then sort of poking at that norm and figuring that out during this process of professionalization, which Jack alluded to earlier. It's an interesting time to be watching that. To drill into something that Surya brought up, for those seeking better data access than Social Science 1 provides, do you have a way to square that with the GDPR, which you flagged? It's the biggest legal barrier and the biggest excuse for companies not to share data. Those seeking access need to come armed with GDPR arguments. Are you armed with your GDPR arguments?
No.
Okay. Cool. Good work. All right.
Can I ask you a question on that? Which is how?
Why?
Oh, come on, you're a lawyer. So how would a public interest defence stand up in the face of that?
So what's interesting in the GDPR is that I think the contours of what news gathering and what exceptions are for news gathering are still fuzzy, right? As with much of the GDPR. But I think there's probably an argument to be made for it. The problem is that you would have to strike the balance between, of course, any infringement on an individual's privacy, an individual who could articulate that claim, versus whatever the newsworthiness is. And I think that's a tricky balance for someone to work out. That doesn't, to me, mean that all data must be tarred with the GDPR brush, right? The world is bigger than Europe, and maybe one way to start playing with this is to create a US sandbox. If we're not going to have real privacy law, we might as well get something out of it. And like see if there's controlled ways of disclosing this data and sort of starting to then poke at and press back this idea of, oh no, the risk of giving you this data will be another catastrophe like Cambridge Analytica. And in so many ways, this feels like a moment of norm translation, right? Of like we're shifting from one configuration of norms of what worked and realizing we live in a world that's maybe different than the one we thought we did 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And sort of to that point of how that happens. I think not to get information apocalyptic, right? But you flag the idea of like information warfare, and maybe this is the future that we're in. But were we to advise sort of not short-term, but medium-term places we want to be in this fight, where should we be? What should be happening? Is it a Supreme Court for all these platforms? Is it some sort of convening? Is it something else? What does a 3-year term look like for this?
I think so. So first of all, one of the things it looks like is, as Casey was mentioning, just the hiring of many more people within the platform companies who actually do perform an articulated editorial role. And I know the platforms are sort of resistant to that, but just having people who understand that process much better. So I think that there's a kind of a medium-term gain here, which is these worlds are converging, and you just have to staff up for them. Because I can't see how you're going. We're not going to be able to separate news, I think, or journalism or speech from these platforms. So they just have to become much more skilled in handling that, which is great, because having had them lecturing us for 20 years about you need to hire more technologists. So that I think would actually improve things. I mean, seldom have more people with editorial skills improve things, but I think this is one case where they might.
This is it's a works program for journalists, for journalism schools. I want to dig into that sort of staffing up resistance, because do you have your finger on aside from the fact that staffing up costs money, and maybe it is just in fact that simple, what's the other hesitation? I mean, we saw after the right to be forgotten decision that, Google, other places did have to staff up and say, all right, we have people who are now the arbiters of these requests that come in. So there is at least some in recent history template for thing happens, staff up, let's go from there. Why has this not reached that same tipping point? And is it just slow and I don't know about it? Totally possible.
I don't completely know. I do think that there is a resistance generally to hiring people into these roles, in part because of the profit thing, in part because of the editorial judgment thing. I've never seen anybody articulate credibly how many moderators Facebook would need to, do whatever it is we think they should do. I mean, I think they have about 30,000 employees now. They've said that at least between 10 and 20,000 of them are devoted to safety and security. So it's already 2/3 of the company. Is it going to be a role where you have 100,000 moderators, and so the actual engineers at Facebook are only, or the sort of non-moderators are only 10% of the company? Like, what is Facebook at that point, right? I mean, these start to become really weird existential questions about what your company is if you decided, well, we have to have one moderator for every 1,000 Facebook users or whatever. I also think there's a question about how well it works. There was an awesome Reply All episode that maybe some of you listened to. I would imagine if I've been in any room where everyone has heard a podcast, it was that one. But what was so great about it was they talked to moderators about the decisions that they had to make, and about how ultimately all of these questions are subjective, and they can write as many words as they want on on those guidelines. And at the end of the day, it's still coming down to, does this piece of content make me feel bad? Which is exactly what they've been trying to get away from the past decade. And so I think they're still trying to figure out, how do you operationalize this so that you can hire people in countries where you still have very little expertise, where you're using third-party staffing firms and training them up and being confident that they're making good decisions. And, you know, again, like, they brought this problem on themselves. It's a very hard problem.
Right. I mean, how you transfer sort of editorial norms that took a long time to develop anywhere, right? Like throughout the penny press, throughout the, sort of centralization, formalization of broadcast media. This took a long ass time to get there.
Yeah, they're very good at speeding up things.
Well,
so they could
fair.
collapse it. But I mean, it is interesting to me that, for instance, in Facebook, and Casey knows much more about this than I do, but my understanding of it is that you have somebody who is kind of responsible broadly for newsfeed and like algorithm building. You definitely have somebody who's responsible for policy and kind of the policy side of it, and then you have a journalism partnerships team, which is now, as far as I know, like the kind of lateral communication between those is sort of haphazard, or not haphazard, but it's not sort of necessarily coordinated. It's nobody's job at Facebook, as far as I know, to come in the morning and say, you know what, this is a really big story today. How are we going to look at it across all of our products? How do we think about the kind of problems that we're going to just broad problems that we're going to anticipate around this, whether it's trending, etc. Because I don't think that this is every single decision on the platform every day. I think that we're talking about from a journalistic point of view, we're talking about a narrow category of problems, and then any kind of appeal system for the outliers, as Josh was saying earlier, kind of good luck if you want anybody, or Ben with his small Peruvian blog, good luck if you want any accountability on that. But just sort of being really clear about who is it who makes those decisions.
Something else I think you're getting at is that, for as hard as some of these problems are, there's still a lot of really low-hanging fruit, right? Generally, there's not more than one huge catastrophe a day on Earth, at least not yet.
Do you ever watch the news?
Like, all I'm saying is, even when we get up to like 7 major catastrophes a day, like that, you can definitely staff up around, right? To monitor how is information about that spreading on the platform. What are the hoaxes and misinformation that people are posting? What is the hate speech? That stuff feels very doable to me. And once you do that, I think you might find that has an outsized positive effect on the rest of the platform. And that if you're hiding the very worst of the stuff that all of us are looking for when we go onto the platform, then actually maybe the platform starts to feel like a nicer place to be. And then they don't have to hire 100,000 people, and they can get away with hiring 30,000.
There's also just like a implicit assumption in all of this that the model of the attention economy is okay. Right.
Yeah, fair.
Like this is all kind of working on the assumption that we are supposed to be staring at our screens for 12 hours a day, and that's just how the world is going to go. So for me, like, start there, right? Like, make it so that exactly. Like we don't like design your like this, like the Tristan Harris sort of like argument about like kind of being kinder to your users and like your health of how you use your devices. But I think like if like there's certain like other ways to kind of promote content that's not being created by organizations and institutions that pay money, right? Like there's many kind of ways in which this can come in, which would affect their business model, but we never get to talk about that part because that's kind of off limits in these conversations. And I think that's like, so we get stuck in like a loop of the.
Yeah, we haven't even touched the problem of the fact that everything is an ad.
Right.
That like literally everything is an ad, because if you want anything seen by anybody, you have to pay for it. And that's kind of a complete, that very much upset the chief executive of the New York Times and many other journalists.
Well, what's interesting on that point is using ads to sort of pierce the noise. I don't know if this says something about my Twitter feed, but I keep having the same promoted ad for the New York Times story about the sex worker who was killed in Queens, and it's a promoted ad to me of a story, which I find fascinating. So the sort of saying we're gonna take this content and just push it into your face using this other channel, right? Because we're not gonna rely on the algorithm to surface this to you 5 times a day. How many times can I read that article? And I'm curious if you're seeing sort of experimentation with how to use the ad model and to hack it to get news content up there around whatever soft censorship
that to
maybe
me
at play.
is the dystopia, right? It's like when it's like it's a linear kind of model between money to eyeballs, right? And then propaganda gets to win without anyone even talking.
Yeah, I don't think there's any like real return on that investment, right? I mean, like that is a lesson that I feel like so many of us media organizations have learned the hard way. Is like you buy ads and it delivers a certain number of eyeballs, but it's all like none of those people come back. You're not building an audience, so you're just sort of like pouring water into a leaky jug.
I've had not the sex worker in Queens. I've had Meghan Markle's tour of the Antipodes, almost non-stop.
He searched different things on the internet. And I think on that note, we will wrap up our panel. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for your insights.